once again, doing a deep dive into the Bible. Well, before I go any further, let me say welcome. It's great to have everybody from the burning flames of the Sierra Nevada mountains to the coastal swamps and floods of the Great Barrier Islands, to the cold Great North, to the Deep South, wherever you are. If you happen to be here, well, man, it is great to have you. And it is the very definition of God's people, people who are gathered around his words. And what we're trying to do here is just simply get the best ideas possible while we're spending time on this mortal coil, i.e. the earth, and to try to satisfy the deep longings of the heart that we know are eternal in their focus. So anyhow, hey, my kids call me Bubba, and so you can too. It started about 24 years ago, and it's a name that has affectionately grown on me, and I'll explain it more in other places. But the essence behind what we're doing is we're admitting that we're human beings, and human beings need a constant check on what the best ideas in life are. Everybody wants to be successful. It'd be weird if people didn't want to be successful. And the Bible itself, God, actually wants you to be successful. But it's not weird, and it's not strange, and it's not unattainable. What the Bible seeks to teach us is what is attainable for every single person. So I'm not going to get off in some sort of weird, everybody can have $1 million in the bank if they love God enough. That's not it. It's just that we as human beings expect God on a more normal set of terms. And the Bible reminds us that the normal way that God speaks to us is actually through the Bible. The words that we have in the Bible is the normal way that God speaks to us. I have been a Christian since I was somewhere around the neighborhood of 26 to 27 to 28, well, probably 28 years old. And I'm just telling you that I have found absolutely nothing nutty and weird about Christianity and the Bible. In fact, I have found just the opposite. It is a breath of fresh air. I have never found something that is too hard to wrap my head around. And everything that I find has actually improved my life. The key is you got to read it right. You can read anything wrong. And not being a good reader myself, I can read many things wrong. And so this quest of mine is just getting everybody to read the Bible well. And if you read the Bible well, you're going to actually hear God talk to you. Speaking of nuttiness, I remember when my early days of Christianity, I had somebody take me aside, very well-meaning Christian, and they told me that, there's a difference between the Logos word and the Rhema word, and, that one is the words on the paper and one's the words of the Spirit, the Rhema word, and that really we need to be functioning on a higher plane in this Rhema word. And it really sounded great to me. I was like, wow, that sounds really cool. And so I went home and I tried to explain this to my wife. And she looked at me with polite eyes for a little while. And when I was done talking, she said, that sounds nutty. And as I was even talking it through with her, I thought, that does sound nutty. And this really doesn't sound like the kind of thing that God would be doing to us, is providing some sort of nutty way to go about things. Instead, we know without a doubt that God can speak to us in a number or any way that he sees fit. But the fact of the matter is we need a straight and normal pathway. And what makes it straight and normal is that God speaks to us through the Bible. In fact, it's the only way that God promises to speak to us. The other ways, there's no promise of God to speak to us in any other way other than through the Bible. So that's why we go to the Bible. Now, when it comes to God, the other fantastic thing is that you learn the best concepts to make you the best human being. And one of the best concepts that we can wrap our minds around and spend time defining is love. Love is one of those things that feels like everybody knows what it is, but the truth is we don't spend enough time defining it. We don't spend enough time really thinking it through. And that's what we've come to in this famous section of the Bible, 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Of course, we've been going through 1 Corinthians from the very beginning to the end. We're going to make our way to the end, but we came to this section in chapter 13 that most people are familiar with because, well, of weddings. It's a passage read in weddings. It seems appropriate for weddings, but the truth is, it's not about weddings. It's good for weddings, but it's about you, and it's about love, and it's about God. And so we have taken a slow, in fact, we have a little borrowed song rhyme. We are low and slow, slow and grow, that is the tempo. Slow and grow, that is the tempo. So we have taken a very slow walk through this chapter, slower than we normally go. And now we're into the kind of final phase of this. So we are going to look at this final portion of 1 Corinthians 13, verse 8 to 13, and we're going to go slow so that we can grow. But now we're going to really see that Paul does mean for us to grow when we understand love. So anywho, since we are coming to an end of our look at chapter 13, I thought it would be best to read it in its entirety, like you were at a wedding. If you're at a wedding, chances are somebody would read it in its entirety. And we already pointed out, too, that actually 12:31 and 14:1 go along with this section. It's the way Paul set it up. Remember that all the little chapters and verses were put in there by some monk in a monastery, and he did pretty good, but he didn't nail it. And so if he would have nailed it, he would have put in 12:31 as 13:1. If that makes any sense to you. Paul didn't put chapters and verses in his writing. In fact, nobody did. That didn't happen until about 600 AD. But that's a time for a different story. For now, though, let's actually do the normal thing and hear what God has to say to us by reading his words. And so, Paul, a guy that God picked, brings us this. But earnestly desire the higher gifts, and I will show you a still more excellent way. If I speak in tongues of men and of angels, but I have not love, I am a noisy gong or clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers, and I understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith to move mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all I have, if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love does not envy or boast. It's not arrogant or rude. It doesn't insist on its own way. It's not irritable. It's not resentful. It doesn't rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, well, they will cease. As for knowledge, it'll pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part, for when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. So now, faith, hope, and love abide. These three, but the greatest of these is love. Pursue love. Earnestly desire the spiritual gifts, especially that you may prophesy. Well, those are God's words. And anytime we read God's words, we ought to pray. It's just that simple. So let's pray, just like the Lord taught us how to pray. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this our daily bread. Forgive us our debts, as we have also forgiven our debtors. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Help us to be better lovers, lovers of you, O Lord, and lovers of others. Let us understand love. We come here to see Jesus and him only. Amen. So the section that we're going to focus on, we're going to call this section Love Grows. Grow up, man. That is the essence of this section. Grow up, man, because love actually grows. If you ain't growing up, that means you ain't loving. Loving and having a proper understanding of love actually grows. And so this fits in nicely as Paul's kind of main thing that he has to say heading out of this passage. For last week and the last 3 weeks before that, we took a look at the definition of love. And Paul has defined the word love with 15 other words and ideas, some positive and some negative. That's how you define words. You define words by actually putting up similar positive words and dissimilar negative words. And then after you let it all come together, you have a sweet spot for a definition. And so love is patient and kind. It does, and that, is the positive section. And he leaves on a positive note too. Rejoices with the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. And then he has this negative section too. It doesn't envy. It doesn't boast. It's not arrogant. It's not rude. It doesn't insist on its own way. It's not irritable. It's not resentful. It doesn't rejoice at wrongdoing. So now that we have the definition that Paul has set us up with, now we need to hear, the final piece, and that is love grows. Love grows you up, grows me up. If we are properly centered on love, we will grow. If we are not properly centered on love, then our development will be arrested. We will be stunted in our growth. We will be adults in diapers. That's right. Making a mess of dirty diapers as adults is a real possibility. You know it. I know it. That's exactly what Paul is going for right here. So let's hit on where Paul takes this final part of the conversation. Paul says love never ends. As for prophecies, they'll pass away. As for tongues, they'll cease. As for knowledge, it'll pass away. Stop. Okay, let's talk about this for a second. First of all, the word ends. Great word. Nothing wrong with that word. Also could use the word fall. And I think that Paul actually is using, based on the word that he picked in Greek, it does mean end, but it also means fall. And fall is, I think, going along with the kind of motif that Paul has been after in this famous love section, all of chapter 13. He has started this conversation by talking about love as the highway, meaning, it is a road that goes up the highest mountain that takes you to the highest place, that kind of thing. And so the idea of mountains is built into what Paul is working with. And so falling off of mountains is a real possibility if you have a road that goes over a mountain. And so Paul saying love never ends or love never falls wants you to have in your mind that the way of love, it never falls. It never falls down. You may fall down. You may give up on love. But the way of love itself, it never falls. It never falters. It never goes off the mountain. It never goes off the cliff. It never ends. Okay, which is kind of interesting if we think about the word fall. It also reminds me of the idea of the, well, we'll hold that thought for a second. I'm going to keep moving on. But then Paul moves into, so love never falls, but prophecies, tongues, knowledge. Prophesying, speaking in tongues, and knowledge. All of those have a shelf life. All of those have an end game. all of those have a dismissal point. But love never ends. Love never falls. Love never has a dismissal point. Love never, passes away. Love never ceases. And the idea, if you don't have it in your mind already, is that love is an eternal thing. Don't forget the Bible tells us that God put eternity into the hearts of man, according to the book of Ecclesiastes. That's what drives us nuts. That's what drives us absolutely crazy, is we have built inside of us this desire for eternity. And the desire for eternity is linked up with the idea of love. Love is actually an eternal concept when it comes to God. Love is the thing that will not end. Love is the thing that will keep going on. Many other things are going to fall off, pass away, cease, whatever you want to call it, but not love, which is very important for us, because what prophesying does and what tongues do and what knowledge does is it actually aids and it assists in God's revelation of himself. So prophesying, speaking in tongues, and knowledge are all serving a bigger concept, and that is getting God's revelation of himself out there. And when God's revelation of himself is getting out there through nature, through the prophetic word, the old prophetic word, the old portion of the Bible, the new portion of the Bible, the person of Jesus, his apostles that he picked for the job of writing things down for us, using their skills. So the nature, the prophetic word, the person of Jesus, and the people that he picked, all of this is about God revealing himself. And the reason why God is revealing himself is because of God's eternal desire for love. And if you fail to respond, we might call that unbelief. But the truth is that it's just a failure to respond to the love that God is demonstrating, that he is putting on display, that he is inviting you into, that he has designed you for, purposefully created you for, and is bringing you into. That is always his direction, because love is the eternal thing. Love is as eternal as God, because God is love. Love's not bigger than God. It's just that love, defined by God, is God's thing. It's his idea. It's his thing. We didn't invent it. God did. And when we start messing with it, we should mess with it on God's terms, because it's his thing. He invented the whole thing. And so the whole angle of revelations of any kind, whether it's through prophesying, whether it's through tongues, or whether it's through knowledge, it's all about coming into the revelation of God's love. Which I got to tell a funny story, and that is, I was actually with a pastor one time, again, a well-meaning brother in Christianity, and I've run into this a few different times, and that is, I run into Christians who really, really, really deeply in their heart of hearts feel that tongues is absolutely essential, and speaking in tongues. And if you embark into this world of the tongue-speaking churches and the tongue-speaking communities, you're going to find a pretty wide and varied mix-up. But the conversation that really sticks out to me is a pastor who, speaking to me, and I guess I'm a pastor too, but he heard my story, and we talked about tongues. We were talking about revelation and God's revelation, and he really he put it down. He put it down this way. He said he felt bad for me that I had never spoken in tongues. He felt like I was really missing something. And that is, I don't know, I find that to be unacceptable, not because if God wants it, well, then that's fine. But the truth is that if we take the Word of God seriously here, tongues is something that ceases. Tongues is something that passes away. Prophecies are stuff that, is not eternal. They're serving a purpose of revealing God's love. And why would we all have to do that? if you have, I'm not trying to take anything away from you. It's just that I think we need to pause on making these kind of demands out of people, because people end up feeling bad whenever they can't do something. And Paul's made it very clear that all these spiritual gifts, all of the gifts that God has available, are not going to be given to all of us all at one time or anything like that. That they all have their purpose, and they should all have the vibe of love and community building behind them. So anyhow, here in this list we find that prophecies, tongues, and knowledge, they're the kind of things that are eventually going to pass away compared to love. Love is the eternal thing. Love is the accessible thing for us all. Tongues is not accessible for us all. All knowledge is not accessible for us all. Prophesying is not really accessible for us all, but love is. Love is accessible for all of us to understand, put into practice, to absorb. You get the drift. And then he moves into, he says, and this is just a beautiful way of putting things. He says, for we know in part, we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. Now I got to say this is a concept that the Bible has an absolute lock on. It's pretty unique territory for the Bible itself, because this makes the point clear that history is actually going somewhere. When I hear the religions and philosophies of the world, I don't get the clear impression that history is going somewhere. In the Bible, history is going somewhere. And where history is going is to the perfect. And the perfect is God. The perfect is in eternity. The perfect is in the future. The perfect in the future, though, is coming. We pray, and we just got done praying, your kingdom come. That's why I say this is a kind of a lockdown principle of the Bible, is that history is going somewhere. It's going to the perfect. The perfect is coming. Every day that goes by, we're getting closer to when God will indeed bring the perfect to us once and for all. And that leaves us with the other side of that conversation, and that is where we are now is not perfect. Where we are now is partial. It's a part. It's a smallness. What we're missing is the entirety of perfection. We get partial glimpses at it, and what this ought to remind us is that the world that we live in, according to the Bible, is absolutely imperfect. It's not perfect. It's not going to be perfect until the perfect, who is God, and his kingdom comes to us. And history finally meets up with when perfect happens. Until that time, though, perfect is coming. It's not here. It's not now. Now, this is absolutely essential for our current modern day thinking, because I know that you get the same sense I do, that there is a growing number of people that somehow, and they're not the Christians, by the way, there's a group of people that's growing and growing that somehow thinks that they can make all things perfect here and now. If you ever want to read a good, thoughtful book on this idea, read Thomas Sowell's Cosmic Justice. Cosmic justice is the idea of perfect cosmic justice that is out there. It's out there. And there are a growing number of people that think that somehow we can demand and have perfect justice and a perfect world. But here's where it gets really ugly. The people who want perfection are the ones who are guaranteed to end up hurting people and making things worse, not better. Because they can't deal with anything that's imperfect. They can't deal with the past that's imperfect. They can't deal with their perception of reality and the present, which is imperfect. And they make demands to make things perfect, but the perfect isn't here. We have to work with a knowledge, a worldview that recognizes us and the world that we live in as grossly imperfect. That it's actually much healthier to understand that human beings are far from perfect. And we used to say things like this: well, nobody's perfect. But there's a growing number of people that I'm not sure that they think like that anymore. And the people that think of themselves and they think of the desire of perfection end up being very harsh and very cruel and very, misled. In fact, they riot when things aren't perfect, and they get in people's faces when things aren't perfect. And at this point, we've got to remember that that kind of behavior does not fit in with love. Love in the eternal, the perfect, is coming. But for now, we've got to work with a very, very imperfect world. Your worldview has to have imperfection in mind. Otherwise, you're going to drive people crazy, and you're going to drive yourself crazy, because this world is going to remain imperfect. That doesn't keep us from trying to make this place better, or as the Constitution says, that perpetual idea of forming a more perfect union. We're going to keep working on it, but we're never going to make it perfect. It's always going to be fraught with humanity, and the humanity, if you know what I mean. Humanity is always imperfect because that's the way things are. It's just realistic. And so Paul, makes it clear that we live in this very part-oriented or partial-oriented world. Cosmic justice, this perfect justice, this perfectionism is not going to really help us. It's only going to end up hurting us and hurting others. Better is the way of love. Better is the way of love that involves forbearance, that involves perseverance, the kind of love that doesn't react but holds tight and puts kindness into play while we wait for the perfect to come, if you know what I mean. And then Paul slips into my absolute favorite passage, because it speaks to me, and I have a feeling it speaks to everybody. And Paul even thinks that it speaks to himself. I love the fact that Paul puts this little piece into the word I, meaning Paul. When I, Paul, was a child, when I, Bubba, was a child, Bubba spoke like a child. Paul spoke like a child. Bubba thought like a child. Paul thought like a child. Bubba reasoned like a child. Bubba, when he became a man, actually set aside childish ways. This is brilliant. Boy, if there was ever a time to memorize something, it's this right here. And one of the things that we need to wrap our minds around is that Paul's an apostle, a guy that we kind of assume is perfect. Funny though, Paul doesn't assume himself to be perfect. Far from it. In fact, Paul is confessing, hey, I've been here. I've been in this place where I was growing. Paul himself is very, very forthright and honest that his beginnings were rough around the edges, to say the least, if not less. Paul confesses that it took him years to come around to God's idea of love. It took him years to come around to who Jesus Christ really was. In fact, Paul, it seems like spent about 10 years away from everybody before he stepped onto the scene and felt like he was really ready to go here. Paul puts himself into a very humble place by saying, when I was a child, when I spoke like a child, when I thought like a child, when I reasoned like a child, when I became a man, I set aside childish ways. So that's pretty cool that the big leaders of the Christian community are people who confessed to their own imperfection. They are not Jesus. They are not God. And they openly make it clear to us, which brings that point to us as well. Which brings us to another point. In some ways, Paul is really not talking about children. Yes, of course, I shared this passage with my children as they grew, reminding them that there was a time coming when they would have to put their childish ways aside, that they should be thinking now as children about not being children, about being adults, about being loving adults, by being kind and patient and rejoicing in truth and bearing things and believing things and hoping and enduring and all of that kind of stuff. But the fact is that Paul has already used this word child to speak to adults. You remember when Paul said, I can't give you spiritual meat because you're still on spiritual milk. You guys are like adults in diapers. It's like you're messing yourself. It's like you need taken care of. You're not growing. You're not maturing. You're not coming into the reality that God has for you. And don't forget the Corinthian church. One of the reasons why Paul's writing this letter is because they've defaulted into their cliques, into their little groups, probably based on ethnicities. The Romans, the Greeks, and the Jews were probably all starting to break up and starting looking at each other funny. And Paul has been addressing how imperfect this is and how this needs to stop. That this is not the work of God in their life. This is certainly not the work of Jesus Christ crucified in their lives. This is not what it looks like to overcome your sin in Jesus Christ, to be forgiven. In fact, Paul is saying we all are oftentimes led by childish ways. Once again, just look at the world around us right now and ask yourself the question, does it seem like we're being led by childish ways more and more? I think so. Whenever I see, the environmental movement being led by a literal child, I think to myself, that doesn't seem serious. As Christians, we should all be about being good stewards of the environment. It is built into, God's messaging to us that we ought to be good caretakers and good stewards of all things, both the environmental worlds and each other. But whenever I see people rioting, whenever I see people responding with anger and animosity and name-calling, all of this, I know I'm increasingly living in a world that is being led by childish ways. And we've got to remind ourselves, and we've got to somehow blaze a path into a better way. And the better way is the way of love. You see, if you're loving, you don't riot. If you're loving, you don't accost people. If you're loving, you understand the complexity of issues and how there's more than one thing that needs to be addressed. And sometimes in this very imperfect world, you have to give and take in order to keep moving forward. That it's impossible to come up with a perfect plan. It's impossible to achieve perfection. And it's this achieving perfection that I think is just absolutely making a mess out of a pretty darn good life that we have going on around us. I do believe that Christianity has changed the world for the better into a more loving, society. Everywhere I look, it seems very loving to me, loving on better levels than ever. But at the same time, I get that sense that childish ways are starting to raise their head. And when childish ways start to raise their head, guess what? Things aren't going to get better. They're going to get worse. Fact. All right. Now Paul moves into the next scene. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. First thing up, we know that Paul has an audience that literally lives in Corinth, and I've already made mention that Corinth is famous for their brass works. And just so you know, fun historical fact, mirrors used to be brass because you could really polish up brass, and almost all mirrors were a very highly polished piece of brass. And the mirrors that we have today didn't exist. So Paul's idea here makes perfect sense, that mirrors, and even the mirrors that we have, are part of a partial. They're part of a dimly reflecting kind of idea. But there's something even better, and that is face to face. You see a picture, a mirror, any kind of reflection isn't the real thing. What we need is the real thing. And Paul is absolutely positive that that is reality. Face to face is coming. It's so important to humbly understand that we live in a dimness. We live in a reflection. We see parts that are really good, but it's only a partial. And in part is what Paul emphasizes here once again. We live in a partial. You see, the fact is that the Bible bends over backwards to assure us that this partial world is the way it's going to be. And a partial world is going to have problems. A partial world is going to have setbacks. A partial world is going to seem like that good is happening to bad people and bad is happening to good people. And it's true. It's not like it doesn't. We know that that's true. But the Bible told us from the very beginning that we were going to be living in a world where Cain killed Abel for no good reason. We see the goodness around. We see the goodness in Abel. We see the goodness all around and available, but we also know that it's not achievable. And that unachievable sense is what is supposed to drive us to long and hanker for God, for a face-to-face with God, because God is love. It's kind of funny that the whole argument about God goes away whenever you meet him face-to-face. The Bible promises a face-to-face. The Bible promises a better reality. The Bible promises a future of eternity and love and perfection. And once again, this is the Bible's territory, that the expectation that God has is that you would be in a face-to-face, not because of God's anger, but because of God's love. You see, Paul says, now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. You see, God does his part. He knows us fully, and he wants to know us fully because he loves. He is the source of love. We are known fully. We are, from God's perspective, fully known. And that we will fully know God. When the kingdom comes, when the perfect comes, we will know God. I don't know about you, but I like that idea. And I don't know about you, but that idea lifts me up. That idea makes me feel good about myself, that God fully knows me and that he loves me the way that I am, but he loves me too much to leave me the way that I am. He is growing me up, and the growth mechanism of God himself is love, patience, kindness, endurance, hope, belief, bearing, rejoicing with truth. These are the ways of love. This is love in action. Envy, boast, arrogant, rude, insisting on your own way, irritable, resentful, rejoicing at wrongdoing. You are off the beaten trail. You're doing your own thing, not God's thing. God's thing is for you to start realizing that you are fully known to God. And the reason why you are fully known to God is because of God's love for you. And I find that to be absolutely invigorating. That gives me motivation to put my feet on the floor, whether I'm feeling good or feeling bad. That gives me motivation to look through the pains and the sufferings and the craziness that this world seems to throw up at every twist and every turn. And so now Paul is ready to leave. And he's going to leave on this idea that love is eternal. But so are faith and hope. So now faith, hope, and love abide. These three. But the greatest of these is love. Why would Paul say that the greatest of these is love? Why not faith? Why not hope? Seem like pretty good things. Maybe they're all equal. Paul says they are not equal. Because faith and hope are actually aspects. Maybe they're features. They're the kind of things that result in a loving relationship. In a truly loving relationship, even between humans, faith and hope become the byproducts, become aspects of that love between two human beings. And the same thing goes with God. Love throws off faith and hope. You see, faith, when the Bible uses the word faith, belief, trust, depend, rely, it's all the same word in Greek, pistos. And when we think of belief, it's not about believing that God exists. It's about trust. It's about reliance. It's about dependence. It's about love. See, in a real love relationship, trust, reliance, dependence, it's a part of love. And hope. Hope is simply the joy of the future when love is around. And Paul says, make no doubt about it, that love is the thing. Faith and hope are awesome, but they're byproducts of love. And so, faith, hope, and love abide together, but yet it's love. It's love that is the greatest of these things, because love directs our faith and directs our hope in a real and meaningful relationship of love with God. And that's why he designed us. That's why he made us. And Paul also now will end properly. We already looked at this word, but he says pursue love, knowing full well that life in a partial world, life in an imperfect world, life in a place that is never going to be perfect, needs to be strived for, needs to be run towards, needs to hold fast to. Actually, action-oriented stuff. You actually have to apply love to get through the partial, to get through the imperfect. Apply love to God, apply love to each other, to the people around you. Apply love. Apply love, and you'll start to make real headway in this world. Riot, yell, and scream, get in people's face, get all jealous, get all boastful, get all arrogant, get all rude, get all insisting on your own way and irritable and resentful and rejoicing at wrongdoing. Well, we will never get anywhere like that. It is love that will set us free. It is love that Christianity has been embarked upon. Hey, have Christians messed things up? Oh my gosh, of course they have, because we're still humans. We are humans who make a mess of things. Christians are humans who make a mess of things. But when it comes to a group of people who have brought love to this world, Christians, nobody does it better. I haven't seen it. And listen, if you want to be a better lover without Christianity, then, well, I guess that's okay. But why? I'd love to hear why you're motivated to love in a better way. Anyhow, not here to make people mad, just here to say that the Bible is putting us in the right place with the right thoughts for the right success in a life that is surely going to be fraught with difficulties and pains, but love is heading into eternity because eternity is coming. The perfect love of God is coming, and God already fully knows us. And so be fully known, expecting that you will fully know God when that day comes. In the meantime, learn to live with the imperfections. Learn to be patient. Learn to be forbearing. Learn to be long-suffering. Learn to be enduring. Long to be bearing all things, the truths of God, believing all things, the truths of God, hoping for all things in God, and indeed bringing that to our fellow man, our family, our friends, our colleagues, and everywhere we go. Let's be the ones who are not adults in diapers, but are actually mature, setting aside childish ways and bringing love to the front and center of our room. Well, that's what I have for us now. And I would be remiss if I didn't say, I love you.